Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Church and State Show. I'm the host and founder of Church and State, Dave Pellowe, and with me on screen right now is Kurt Mahlburg, writer extraordinaire and a great Christian thinker at where you can see all of his work at the Canberra Declaration, but I also publish the best picks on the Good Source and send them out to our weekly newsletter. So let me start by saying welcome, Kurt.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's awesome to be with you.
So, guys, this is a pretty relaxed kind of conversation I'm going to be having with Kurt. I've been feeling for a while I need to try and do the same number of conferences that I'm doing and bring the Church and State Show back. We've been in hiatus for probably a year or even a little bit more now. We first started back in 2017. And we're just doing so many conferences, nearly a conference every month this year. So it's been it's a full schedule. But now's definitely not the time to be taking the foot off the gas, doing less conferences or otherwise, because the hour is dire. What we've just seen in America with the assassination of Charlie Kirk is tragic on a whole lot of personal levels, a whole lot of human levels, but on a political, social, cultural level, my heart is breaking for the West and certainly for America about what that says about us, what it says about these democracies that we've built over centuries. Australia has the 8th oldest continuing constitution in the world, and America's, of course, is the oldest, most successful still continuing constitution, and for the liberties and virtue of a nation to descend to the point where the rhetoric breeds a assassin of unapproved opinions, and that is where we are. We'll get into that more, but I just want to explain that this is going to be a series in the Church and State Show, and I'm calling it How to Save Australia. We could call it How to Save the West or any other nation in the West, How to Save Canada, How to Save England, How to Save America. But we're Australians. We love our nation. This is where God has put us. And it is our duty to seek the prosperity and the welfare of the city, the state, the nation in which God has put us. Acts 17:26 says that God created appointed seasons and appointed boundaries for nations so that we might search for him, and even while stumbling and groping might find a revelation and a knowledge of the one true God, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I'm just going to be inviting as many people as I can. I'm going to record these as fast as I can. It's not going to be a schedule. It might be like while I'm away on conference. It might be 2 weeks where I do nothing, and there might be a week where I do 3. We're just going to do them as far. In fact, right after this, I'm doing another one with a young man who really impressed me. That'll be at around 5 o'clock Queensland time, 4:30 Australian Central Time. But I wanted to get Kurt on because he's a great friend. We've been working together for a long time. He's spoken at many church and state conferences, and I want to ask people like Kurt, and today, Kurt's first cab off the rank. Let's unpack it. Let's explore this question. There's going to be more than one solution, and this conversation over the coming series will help you identify the areas and the strategies where you fit best. It won't be one size fits all, and it won't be all fit one size. This is going to be multiple strategies needed, multiple battlefronts, and one commander and Lord, and that is the King of Kings, the God of Gods, the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. The one thing that I like from Charlie Kirk, let me actually play this video now. This really summarizes the mission I've been on for 9 years now.
The enemy comes to lie, steal, and divide and destroy. And we cannot allow those unclean spirits to get into the church family. We need a strong foundation against the spiritual darkness of this day more than ever before. That we serve an almighty God, and he commands us to care about the nation that we are in. The most important thing we can do is to win souls for Jesus Christ. The second most important thing is to make sure we can do the first thing. And if we allow our theological differences to lead in all of our conversations, we'll be having these theological disputes from prison.
So there's Charlie saying the one most important thing that we can do to save our nation is to win souls for Jesus Christ. That's an end in itself, saving souls. It's certainly good for the nation. But he says the second most important thing for us to do is to protect our ability to do the first. That's why we're in politics. That's why we care about policy. It's because the gospel of Jesus Christ must be proclaimed. And right now, we've got the nation raging against Christianity, literally banning prayer outside abortion clinics, literally banning conversion therapy, also known as the historical mission of the church since 33 AD. This is exactly what we do. We lead people from deception to truth, from darkness to light, from death to life, from Satan to Jesus. And those are the only two choices. So that's the purpose of this series. I apologize, Kurt, for such a long introduction, keeping you waiting there in the wings. But I just wanted to share with the audience what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the motivation and inspiration. Now is the time to double down, not slow down. So, Kurt, thank you for being my guest today. And why don't you lead straight off with some preamble, preface thoughts about the purpose of this, and then I'll get into the pointy question: how do you think we can save Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I mean, I loved your introduction. You've set up a lot of really important themes. As you say, you and I have been working together for probably 5 or 6 years now, and it's been an awesome privilege. And just networking with like-minded believers around Australia who are passionate for freedom and for faith and family, all of the things that have made Australia great and are going to take us into the future if we've got a future. And that's really kind of the point that we are at. Obviously, we've been focused on Charlie Kirk's assassination these last couple of weeks, as well we should be. I've also, I think because of the news about Brett Sutton, we might touch on that later on today, but, essentially he's come out saying, oh, yeah, I made a whole bunch of mistakes during COVID. It's like, we could have told you that 4 or 5 years ago if you were listening to us, but instead you were calling us conspiracy theorists. But that's made me reflect a lot on COVID. And, I was maybe a bit more naive in 2020 when the lockdowns began, when 2021, when mandates began. But it was clear to me very quickly in that whole COVID saga that values I assumed we took for granted in Australia and as Australians, things like freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom to worship, freedom of religion, and then freedom, even other freedoms like the freedom of movement and freedom to leave our country and to come back into it. Those, I'd always just assumed that, I'd grown up saying I live in a free country, and I had sort of assumed everyone thought the same. And all of a sudden I realized I'm sharing a country with a lot of people who really don't care about these values, certainly not to the extent that I do. And they're willing to put, make them subservient to the science and all sorts of other very sort of Johnny-come-lately, values that have just sort of taken center stage. And it was of great concern to me seeing what our country did. And now watching how half or more of our country has responded to Charlie Kirk's assassination, it only reinforces the fact that that simple values like freedom of speech and freedom of religion simply are not grasped or believed by, I would say, maybe the vast majority of Westerners today, certainly in countries like Australia. I think in the US, things are a lot better. Essentially, we're seeing something of a revival that God is stirring there, which is just phenomenal. And again, hopefully that's something we touch on a bit later today. But, by contrast, we've got stadiums full of people worshiping Jesus, coming to faith, hundreds of people getting baptized, reports of millions of people going to church, and particularly Gen Z generation going to church for the first time ever over the last couple of weekends. And here in Australia, we've got, the Human Rights Commission telling us that we need to ban climate misinformation. I mean, the contrast could not be sharper. So there's something of incredible faith and the heritage of Christianity in the US that they are enjoying. It's a legacy that they're continuing on. They've obviously got a really great administration in office at the moment. And in Australia, there is a remnant of faith, and there's certainly a stirring of that. I believe God's not forgotten our nation. But by contrast, there's just not that same rich history. And I think the freedoms we once took for granted are now, very much not being valued. So again, the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination, the fact that there's even people kind of thinking, I don't really know what to make of it. It's like, I know what to make of it. It's absolutely wrong to shoot someone for being a conservative. Why is there not that same level of just moral clarity? It's just so obvious to me that what happened to him was absolutely evil, and why cannot 100% of Australians call that out? So again, it comes back to, these freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Where have we gone? How have we lost our way? So they're just a couple of opening reflections for you.
Yeah, thank you. Look, there's a whole bunch in there I'd love to talk about. I just love talking politics, and I love talking about Jesus, and I love talking with friends like you about those two things. But the hour is urgent, and there's an urgency in my spirit to point to the solution. And I want to talk about this a whole lot, but I've got you on to ask you the question. So first, Kurt, what do we need to do to save Australia? Is the answer in parliaments or people or churches? And I'm sure there's more than one answer, but let's start exploring that issue together, that question, you and I together: how to save Australia.
Yeah, I mean, you've given a few good indicators there, that people getting back to church, prayer, worship, focusing our eyes on Jesus. There's obviously the political route as well, and we can talk about all of those things. I guess for me, I'm in the media space, independent media, proudly, not legacy. But I'm very passionate about truth. I'm very passionate about the sorts of information that shapes our worldview. I've been interested in worldview probably since I was in my late teens. I love Francis Schaeffer. I read a lot about creation and evolution, a lot about apologetics. And I think from those early days, I realized that the information that I consume and the fundamental beliefs about the world that I live in, those things are so important. They create a framework for assessing, the daily events of life and the daily occurrences in politics. And I think, unfortunately, the vast majority of Australians, and I would say probably the majority of Australian Christians, just have a worldview that is so fundamentally shaped by secularism that, for me, that's really a starting point. I think if we can get our churches, at the very least, to end their addiction to the legacy media. And I suppose there's more than the legacy media these days. A lot of younger people are on social media and they're listening to supposedly independent voices, but with very much the same kind of agenda as a lot of the legacy media. But that stuff is shaping Christians' worldview significantly. I grew up in a family with fantastic Christian values, and like a lot of Christian families, I was encouraged, not to watch certain things and not to consume certain, whether it's movies or TV shows or computer games, and for good reason, because obviously that kind of stuff can really rot your brain and shape your worldview in terribly negative ways. But I think a lot of Christians have kind of grown up now into adulthood, and they might have had some of those values in their family growing up, but they've never applied the same principle to the news. And I would say, just as, violence and sexual content and some of these in profanity and other things in movies and TV shows is very detrimental to our faith, I'd say perhaps even more so, what's detrimental to our faith is consuming legacy media as though it's telling us the truth, because it's not. And obviously there's a lot that the legacy media, will tell us day to day that's fine. It's neutral information. It might be the weather, it might be sporting events, it could be some local politics or whatever. But generally speaking, when it comes to national politics and when it comes to international politics, and specifically US politics, where God is doing a lot of amazing things right now.
Yeah, you're right.
Christians are consuming propaganda, outright propaganda, that has been designed to sour them towards their own Christian values, and embitter them towards their own fellow Christians, and think skeptically about the role of the church in society. So I just think, I think media is a really important starting point. I'm very passionate. I mean, I'm writing for the Daily Declaration, and we We've grown, and since January, we've sort of doubled in subscriber numbers, which has just been amazing. We only launched, I think it was 2019. So we've seen phenomenal growth in that time. And we publish 5 news and commentary stories per day at the moment. And that's, continued to grow. I'm sure that will grow into the future. But I'm very passionate about truth. I'm very passionate about presenting news, both global politics, national politics, and cultural events from a Christian perspective, and just providing an alternative to the propaganda that is force-fed to us in the newspapers and on the nightly news. And so I'm very passionate about encouraging Christians to break their addiction to those things, because, like I say, not all of it's terrible. But a lot of it is, and a lot of it has been very cunningly shaped to really change the way Christians think, or everyone thinks, but it's having a really deleterious effect on Christians and churches, because Christians are consuming it as though it's true, and it's just not.
Yeah, look, a stark example of the lack of discernment, it would be the amount of Christians who are criticizing Charlie Kirk, the amount of Christians who are saying he was mean, nasty, evil, wicked, white supremacist. I've been headbutting one dear Christian lady recently, and I'm just like, I don't know where these people get their information. I actually saw one link where I just challenged her in the headbutt, where I'm just like, you are remorselessly full of hate and bile. All these statements about the Christian right being overwhelmingly white supremacist is just a lie. It's a demonic deception. You've got no idea what you're talking about, and all you can offer is vagaries. So she gave me a link of Charlie Kirk saying 4 individual black women, and I can't remember all of their names. One of is Justice Ketanji Brown, and Michelle Obama, and there was 2 others. And what Charlie Kirk was saying was that these 4 individuals had admitted that they wouldn't have got their jobs if it wasn't for affirmative action. And he basically said they don't have the brain power to get the jobs that they've got. And because of affirmative action, was needed, what they've basically confessed to or admitted is that a black person got a job a white person would have got if it wasn't for affirmative action. And for them to then say, well, what she's basically inferring from that is Charlie Kirk said all black women have inadequate brain power. And I was like, it's not even close to what he said.
It's incredibly dishonest.
Incredibly dishonest. And what it does is it projects the fullness of their heart, which is this woke spirit that sees systemic injustice where it doesn't exist everywhere. It's this massive deceitfulness, but their ability to consume media, I guess you might be saying that they've been shaped to reach these conclusions by all of their media consumption choices leading up to this point, not just their inability to comprehend what's actually going on in that clip.
Yeah, I mean, like any habit, Dave, the other day I was thinking about Pavlov's dog. I'm sure you're aware of that experiment. Are you aware of that experiment? Would most viewers be aware of what I'm talking about? Yeah, Pavlov's dog, like ring a bell, and dogs have been programmed to salivate. I think the same is true of any habit in our lives. We make these associations because of the way God designed the brain, that the way that the neurons fire in the brain and create channels that become more and more established over time. And the same is true of our use of our media consumption. We've been programmed, or we've programmed ourselves to go back to the same sources over and over and over again. ABC News, 7 p.m. at night, whatever it is, every day, or the, certain newspapers, our national or our city's biggest newspaper. Yep, that's the truth. That's the truth. And you program yourself to thinking this is where I find out what's going on in the world. And I just want to say, by opening that newspaper and by turning on that 6 or 7 o'clock news report, you are not finding out what's going on in the world. You are finding out what particular people want you to think about the events that are going on in the world. And the lady or the person that you referred to just now, they have obviously gone back to this same source of apparent information over and over again for years on end, and they've read that Charlie Kirk was a white supremacist, and so they've just believed that that's true. They haven't looked it up for themselves. They haven't questioned it. And I think if you were to show them very clearly that he is not, show them the clip that you referred to where he actually says everything in context and he's having a go at affirmative action, not specifically at black women, or if on the other hand you were to hear from all of these African-American people who, since Charlie Kirk's passing, have said he didn't hate me. He loved me. He reached out to me. He gave me a leg up in my career. I've got great respect for him. He always was polite and kind to me, which I've seen plenty of that too. There's been a lot of people a lot of black Americans who've praised Charlie Kirk in the wake of his death. You could show all of that stuff to these same people, and it probably still wouldn't quite be enough to deprogram them, because the source of truth that I've always trusted my whole life told me this, so it has to be true. So that's what I mean. This is not, it's not easy. It's easy for me to come on here and say, Christians, please stop trusting these legacy media brands. But actually for Christians to enact that is going to take some time. It essentially is a form of unbrainwashing or re-education or deprogramming that's going to need to take place en masse among Christians in Australia and Christians throughout the West, because we've come to trust these sources like Pavlov's dog. We hear a bell and we salivate. We read a newspaper report and we just assume that what it says is true. And I mean, there's so many reasons over the last 4 or 5 years for us to go, okay, what I'm being told here is not true. Take COVID, take the 2024 election. Yeah, sorry.
No, you're right. The problem is she showed me the video. I had to comprehend it and interpret it for her. I had to point out, no, he wasn't talking about all black women. He was talking about 4 black women. And if it was his idea, that would probably still be mean. But they identified themselves as people who wouldn't have benefited without the finger of racial prejudice on the scales of their recruitment and opportunity processes. I had to point out to her that God detests lying scales and unfair balances. This is in the Psalms and Proverbs. This is scripture.
And James, favoritism. God hates favoritism.
God hates it. Now, again, to steel man their argument, to put the best case forward of their position, what they would say is that the scales are already unbalanced and affirmative action is just correcting the balance. But this comes from an assumption that's not substantiated in fact. It's a highly debated belief, and there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. There's plenty of evidence that, Barack Obama himself talked about black culture pouring scorn on education. He said that African Americans described that as acting white. When you wear a watch, turn up on time, get an education, be diligent, and succeed and excel in your chosen career path. When you're not sleeping around but faithful to your wife and raising the kids you have with her, you're acting white. That's Barack Obama's words, and it's a well-documented phenomenon that there's this cultural impetus against success. To say that, and all I'm pointing out here is that there's more than one factor which explains. It's not just the ascendancy and cultural dominance of white people in traditionally white nations. There's so much complexity here. The infuriating deceitfulness of the oversimplification, if not outright lying and fraud about the causes behind. Like at the end of the day, you put your finger on the scales because you're trying to disqualify better qualified people. And if qualification only was the thing you were arguing for, it wouldn't be called affirmative action. It would be called, let's make it illegal to discriminate on the grounds of race, which, by the way, we have done.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing here, because the civil rights movement in the US was about, certainly there was imbalance prior to that. African American people were severely mistreated and segregated in all sorts of ways in society. And the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act that did level the playing field, so that black and white were essentially, it established the idea of color blindness when it came to hiring for jobs and treatment in just about every sphere of society. And what affirmative action has done is actually, made an overcorrection, and that's so obvious to anyone who wants to see it. And sadly, it's also underpinned by an extremely anti-Christian worldview. Which, and I get a lot of flack for saying this, but it's called Western Marxism. Marxism was the idea. Karl Marx promoted this idea that there's the bourgeois and the proletariat, and in order to establish communism and utopia, we needed to get the lower classes economically to overthrow the upper classes. Then we'd have bliss. That didn't work. It certainly didn't work in the West. It worked in the non-Western world. Revolutions all over the place. A pile of corpses 100 million high. And in the decades that followed,
no exaggeration. That's no exaggeration.
It's probably close to 150 million corpses in communist revolutions around the non-Western world. It didn't stick in the West, and the reasons for it, the Marxists identified, were Christianity and capitalism. And so what they did for years and years is try to hammer those two things. And I, the whole Western Marxism thing, people assume I'm saying there's a conspiracy of these people kind of secretly hiding out, trying to wage revolution. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is a Marxian worldview underpins things like affirmative action, because what it's done is it's moved the category from economics, the lower class and the upper class. It's moved it to every other sphere of culture. So it's now black versus white. It's women versus men. It's disabled versus abled. It's pick your category. It's straight versus queer. And so affirmative action, the underpinning belief system there is that non-whites are still being suppressed. They're the underdogs. They're being oppressed, and white people are the oppressors. And the only way for us to fix things is to actually give preferential treatment to non-whites. That's the entire premise of affirmative action. And Charlie Kirk was against that as well. All of us should be. That's what he was speaking out about in that video. And unless you know this background, you're going to be deceived, like this lady was that you talked about.
Yeah, that's right. And Ketanji Brown Jackson, her confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court justice position she now has, put a lot of doubt to her intelligence when asked to define a woman. It's become a meme that she couldn't define a woman. Because she obviously knows what a woman is. It's not like she had inadequate brain power to define a woman, but for some reason, she turned off her brain and chose not to use it, instead leading with her feelings and her heart, the tyranny of empathy, tyrannical or toxic empathy, which Charlie's been again misquoted as opposing all empathy. There's again, if I can just explain this, there's this line where empathy is good until you've got so much empathy you start betraying and violating truth and being demonically deceitful about people's identity and biology and design according to God Almighty. That's the point at which empathy becomes toxic. Empathy is good. Toxic empathy is overdoing God's good gift and using it to hurt people, which is why Charlie Kirk was opposed to it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, just again, I mentioned COVID earlier. COVID's a perfect example of that. We had so much empathy in Australia that we locked children inside of their homes for hundreds of days at a time, deprived them of education, deprived them of a social life, put them way behind now in every metric of their mental and educational health and all sorts of things. We had so much empathy that we force injected the entire population, apart from those who chose not to and lost their jobs, lost their mortgages, like so much empathy. Empathy is not a virtue. Empathy is a neutral emotion, and it can be used for incredible good, and it can be used for incredible evil. And the West, in many, many occasions over these last few years, have used empathy, weaponized it, and done untold damage, which a lot of people still have not admitted to. But we are living in the aftermath of that still.
Yeah, I'd like to see criminal charges for that. Look, we've spoken about 15 minutes complaining about the problem, and that's not a terrible thing. It's good to know you're not going insane, and there are people who are committed to truth who understand it the same way you do. So I'm not saying we should, but the question is how to save Australia. So you've diagnosed that the problem is people are making bad content choices with their news media, amongst other things. I assume the people who are watching this show are not taking The Guardian as gospel truth, or the Sydney Morning Herald, or the gay activist journalists who really hate Pentecostal megachurch pastors. But what do we do? How do we solve this problem, Kurt? What's the solution? I mean, if the people watching it have already made good choices, how do we unroll the solution of better media, better information sources, the promotion of truth? How do we propagate that in the nation?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's going to be, down to the individual sharing what they're reading. As you say, a lot of people who are watching us right now, they are making great media choices. They're probably subscribed to The Good Source and the Daily Declaration and similar outlets. There's a lot of them around Australia, and that's fantastic. But I guess my encouragement would be, when a big news story happens, share one article about that with people that you're in conversation with, and they don't see things the same way because they're still kind of glued to the TV or the newspapers. And probably another one, obviously, so that's digitally you can do that, whether it's by email or on your social media and that sort of thing. But I think as well in person, just having a bit more boldness to speak up. In person, it's not like I talk politics all the time with the people that I hang out with. I love doing so if they're interested, but I'm not the sort of person that just wants to insert politics everywhere, because I also want to just have a life and enjoy the beautiful life that we've got in Australia. One thing I've tried to do over the last few years is to be just a bit bolder, both in terms of my faith as a Christian, but also when it comes to some of these, prickly political issues, rather than kind of hedging my bets or waiting to hear what someone else says. And I don't come at it in a spiteful way. I just say, yeah, that's ridiculous. Or, I just up front tell them what I think. And then that opens a door to be able to share just a bit more like, oh, why do you think that? And so that's something I've had to work on myself. It's something I encourage our viewers to do as well, in person, not just online, but in person. Just be that little bit bolder when topics like this come up. You probably are better prepared than you think you are because you've been consuming good content and you've got a lot of knowledge now about many of these issues. So just be that bit bolder and bring that up. So, and that goes for church as well. At church after a service on a Sunday, be willing to lean into some of these topics because people are thinking about them. Christians are trying to, form their thoughts about these things. And it's not, I guess I didn't want to give an impression earlier on that in every single church, the majority or half of the people are totally, addicted to the mainstream media or whatever. That's probably not the case. There's probably a bunch of people in the middle who don't really care a whole lot for it. They're probably somewhat conditioned by it, but don't have a particular, taste or distaste for it. And they're probably the persuadable middle. But just be willing to lean into some of these conversations because I think a lot of Christians are, they're wrestling with these things. And God is on the move right now. We're seeing that in the US, but I'm certainly hearing stories about that here in Australia as well. I don't know if you saw this, Dave, but the Daily Mail wrote an article mentioning me and my X feed as the possible source of something Trump said in his speech at Charlie Kirk's memorial service.
I did see that, Kurt. Yeah.
Yeah. So whether or not that's the provenance of it, I'm not sure. But I certainly did tweet something on my X feed and Facebook several days ago, maybe a week ago. It was from a pastor friend here in Adelaide who is very much involved in a whole kind of string of campuses of churches with various campuses. And he said that God has been bringing like quite a few new people to his church over the last month. And that's been happening for some time, but it's really kind of ramped up in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And people have like been very vocal in saying, yep, this is why I'm back. I've come back to church because of what happened to Charlie Kirk. And that's just one of many stories that I have heard. I keep hearing more and more. Sky News has done some great segments on this. There's a few great Christian hosts like James McPherson, and they've been leaning into this and been giving reports of people returning to church in Sydney and big baptism events in the US. And so God is absolutely on the move, and it's happening particularly among the younger generations. But God is stirring a lot of questions in Christians, no matter their age. And I think we're in a pretty amazing moment, because I think there's probably more open minds and more open hearts to these issues, even among Christians, than there has been in some time. So I think there's a great opportunity before us as well.
I'm just going to share that now. I might go to full screen. There we go. Oh, that's not very close to full screen, but why is that not? Anyway, here's your message. Maybe if I just trying to make this optimize fit. That's getting better. Prominent Australian pastor just messaged me privately to say Charlie Kirk's martyrdom brought a whole bunch of new people to his church this morning. God is moving. So this is the message. We already had a lot happening this past month, but it seems to have grown since these successive cultural moments, and ultimately since Charlie was killed. All that to say, you're doing a great job, and amen to that, of course. What other areas, Kurt, do you think Australians need to be engaged and look for solutions to save the nation?
Yeah, I think educating ourselves around politics. You're really good at this, Dave, and I've learned a lot from you. And honestly, it's been like this crash course in Australia's political system for me over the last 5 years, because I remember, I think I was in year 5 when I was first taught, our parliamentary system, and just some of the basics about what it means to be living in the Commonwealth of Australia.
Not to gratuitously farm compliments, but to actually research live with you now. I'd love to do more of this and focus it in the pointy bits that are needed, and not waste time in the foam and froth on the periphery. But where are the places that you think you needed more education that you got, whether from church and state or elsewhere, that a lot of people what's the actual topics and mechanics that people need to be taught?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, 6 years ago, just as on the cusp of getting into the sort of cultural political commentary space, I was still getting my head around the fact that Australia has 2 houses in Parliament. That's so basic, but the whole checks and balances thing, like we have 2 houses so that one, generally speaking, writes the legislation and passes it, and then the Senate is the House of Review to make sure that there's a lot of eyes over the sorts of laws that we're passing. Even the simple principles, like when we elect MPs for our local electorate, they represent us. Like they're not our rulers. They're not emperors. They're not gods. They're representatives. They're servants. They're ministers. That's a really specific language that was chosen in Western countries and specifically in Australia. Yeah. They're ministers. They're servants. They're there to serve, and they're there to represent us. And so and the other thing I think is, as an Australian, I help run this country. That's what a democracy means. I run this country through my elected representative in Canberra. That's a concept that was totally new to me until very recently. I only really learned about probably the last 5 years. I think Vishal Mangawadi's book, The Book That Made Your World, was very helpful in me understanding some of these basic concepts. So it comes down to really, really simple stuff like that. That we're no longer ruled by an emperor. The law doesn't somehow abide in a particular person. The law, actually abides in a document, the Australian Constitution, and that's obviously been expanded through the laws we've passed since. But we're governed by that law. We're not governed by a ruler. So just some of these basic kind of concepts when it comes to the way parliamentary democracies work. But then more than that too,
that's
understanding.
Super helpful to me because that's super helpful to me because I don't. I guess I take what I know for granted and don't know what other people don't know. I remember somebody who's very close to me, who I won't name because it might be embarrassing, and she had no idea what the Senate was or what it was for. And this is well into adulthood. This is, at 30, mid 30s. And it was when I was getting into this that I discovered so many people don't know the basics. And that's not an indictment on the average Australian intelligence. It's an indictment on the average Australian education. Look, thanks for letting me
everything. Yeah, I mean, we know everything about our favorite football team, or about our particular hobby or whatever. So it's not like we lack the ability to process information or even lack sources for it, because we could find any of this stuff out that I've just said. But it's obviously a lack of interest. As you say, education's a big part of it as well. But just to dig a little bit deeper, that's some of the real basic framework. But then more specifically, like understanding the parties, the way parties work, the two major parties, minor parties, the way that factions work even within the major parties, because that's got, that determines a lot about which leaders go up for pre-selection, which candidates go up for pre-selection and then can be elected. And you've been really good on this, Dave, in helping Australians and Christians understand that even though a party might stand for certain policies and values, we should not write off whole parties because there might be an individual candidate or person in that party that is a Christian, that is going out swinging for Christian values, doing fantastic stuff. I mean, Alex Antic is a brilliant example of that. Matt Canavan, Jacinta Price, we could name a whole bunch of them. You could easily write off the Liberals or the Liberal National Coalition, but we shouldn't do that wholesale, because there are some fantastic Christian voices that really are doing God's work. So it's important not to sour ourselves totally to whole parties, but to be a lot more nuanced in the way we think about these things. So,
yeah, important note. The other thing I like teaching people is not to vote for Christians, and that is to say not to vote for people just because they say they're Christians. Obviously, I want people voting for Christians as long as they're mature, well-formed Christians, well-discipled, confident in the Word of God, with a high view of Scripture, and a really strong spine. Because a Christian with no spine might as well be a devil worshipper. You're just going to, do the wrong thing because it's good for your career, instead of doing the right thing because you've got strong convictions. So somebody identifying as a Christian isn't enough.
I mean, on that point, our current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he's a Christian, so-called. He identifies as a Catholic. Yeah, that's exactly right. Catholic. And Anthony Albanese wouldn't even put his hand on the Bible at his swearing in. So that's the caliber of Christian. But as you say, people who they might actually attend church.
Sorry, you say that. I want to jump in, but I talked over the topic, so it was lost. Repeat that
last
sentence.
Right. Yeah, so that's a probably particularly poor example. But as you say, there are Christians who do actually have a fairly well-formed theological understanding. They might attend church, but if they're not willing to stand up on these really crucial issues, the cultural issues, the social issues, things like abortion, euthanasia, and just basic freedoms, freedom of religion, and these pointy issues, the transgender stuff, then they're not really worth voting for. So it's about not just about what they kind of say they believe as an inner conviction. It's about what they are willing to stand up for and stake their name and reputation on when it comes to those really crucial moments in Parliament and before the media.
Yeah, so true. I was talking to a politician, a senior, well-respected conservative Christian politician at CPAC in Brisbane this past weekend. And there's such a reluctance, and he's just one example. It's generally true. There's such a reluctance to bring their faith into the public square. There's such a reluctance and reticence. Even they don't want to talk about the importance of God to Australia, to public policy. It's almost become dogmatic that we leave God out, so that even the Christians are unwilling to do so. Even the strong conservatives, the strong Christians, seem to feel like it will be a handicap to their career to express a strong personal faith and confidence in Jesus Christ as the solution for all the world's and each individual's troubles. And it's I'm so blessed and moved and jealous to see the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, most of the cabinet at Charlie Kirk's memorial service declaring the truth and the wonders and the glory and the lordship of Jesus Christ, the gospel, the necessity of personal salvation. And it's like, can you imagine? It's I need an imagination to visualize an Australian politician in office or after office being so bold with the communication that only God can save a nation, Australia, America, England, like only a reformation. And you know what? Revival isn't enough, Kurt. Revival is not enough. We could have a revival of Islam and all we've got is bad ideas multiplied. But a revival of cowardly Christianity, lots of people going to church all of a sudden, becoming Christians and still being afraid to preach the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, creation, salvation, genders, biology, marriage, sanctity of life. The lack, a revival of a cold Christianity is not going to save the nation. We need reformation.
And what's more, I think that's an oxymoron, Dave. And I think there might be people out there there probably are people out there who think, yep, I want to see revival in the church in the Western Australia. And it's going to, I hope it's going to happen from the kind of squishy middle, from the people who are not really wanting to get involved in politics or take a strong stance on any of these issues. But I think what we've seen in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination is that that's just not the case. Like that's not going to happen. You're not going to get a revival of lukewarm Christianity or culturally disengaged Christianity or hedging your bets both ways Christianity. That's not going to happen. Where there's the fire, and the thing is, this is what God always does in revivals.
All of those people who are giving their lives to Jesus, where are they going to go? If they go to lukewarm churches, they might start hot, but do you really think so?
Well, the fact that it's Charlie Kirk who was killed, which has been the impetus for them to return to church, they know who he is. They know what he stood for. So my sense is these are people who have been fairly aware, at least to some degree, of the basically the culture war, the major tension that has been, tearing American society in half for years and years and years. And now a figurehead of one very clear side of that culture war has been assassinated in broad daylight, and that's been the reason they've returned to church. So that's telling me that the people who are getting saved at the moment or who are returning to church, picking up their Bible, they're actually entering into this with a preloaded set of assumptions and even convictions when it comes to the culture war. And to the degree that that's happening in Australia too, I think that's the case also, that these are people who have been, to this point, fairly afraid of getting dipping their toes into the culture war, but they realize, man, like someone's getting shot for standing up for the basic stuff I believe. My sense is that is where God is stirring revival. It's not among the politically disengaged. It's among the people who have opinions on this stuff, but don't have an underpinning for it, don't have a spiritual and religious and faith-based underpinning for it. And now they're looking for that.
I want to say amen and God protect them, because church is a great place to beat a passion for the culture war out of you. There's many churches that will smother that and say, we don't do that. And if not maliciously, and I'm not trying to be cynical, I go to church every week and I love my church, but and I love the church universal, and I want to see the church thrive. But this is part of the burden, and what we're talking about is, are our churches places that will nurture, disciple, and harness the energy of people who want to save the nation, or are we going to make these people nice? And
I mean, that's a huge challenge for church leaders, and I hope obviously there's a bunch listening that are thinking this stuff through and thinking about the implications. And I very much hope that churches do not squash what God is trying to do in the hearts of these young people. But if I think back to when I was a teenager in my early 20s,
deliberately.
No, and I'm certainly not saying that. No, but I think there's like you said, there's
I'm saying that.
Yeah, no, there's just something about the nature of institutions and all the different people that you're needing to cater to in church that ultimately will, in many cases, I think, squash this fire that people have. But Dave, if I think back to when I was in my late teens, early 20s, when my faith was being formed, if there wasn't something going on in church that was catering to our my and my friends' hunger for whether it was apologetics or deeper into doctrine or whatever it was, we'd start it ourselves. We'd just start Bible studies, gather as young men around a campfire. There were a lot of things that I got involved in at that age because God was at work in me and pumping me up in my faith. And where it lacked in the institutional church, so to speak, we just kind of did it. And generally speaking, our churches were fine with it. Like, they might kind of be like, I don't know about that, but encouraged to see you guys, doing what you're doing. So I don't necessarily think it's all going to be hosed down. But my warning to pastors, as you've indicated, would be, please don't deliberately hose it down and just steward what God's doing and listen to the concerns of what these young people are saying, because they're aware of who Charlie Kirk is. They know what he stood for. They probably share a lot of his values, and they've felt like they're up against it in the culture. Don't make them feel like they're up against it in the church too.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, and I want to speak to the pastors and encourage, maybe even go into that a little bit further. I mean, we should probably wrap up in the next few minutes, but the other thing I want to say to the people watching, if you're looking for a church, there are plenty around. You might have to look for a little while, but please ask God to lead you to a church that will not smother the smoldering wick, that will not put out that flame that needs to be fanned within you. God needs you in the mission to save this nation. He loves and delights working through and with his people. If you're in a woke church or just a feminized church that's too nice to be any use to anybody, then pray about it carefully. I don't want people leaving churches willy-nilly. I hate that. But I don't want you staying in a cold church either. Make sure you don't give up on the church. Please don't give up fellowship of the saints. You need to have communion. You need to have corporate worship. You need to be in a community of believers. There's no better solution for big government than to make family big and to make church big in your life. And they should be your first safety nets long before the government. And you need to be that safety net for other people as well. So I'm not dissing church. And if you are likewise frustrated with churches that haven't been everything you're looking for, please hear me again. Go find a better one. There are good ones out there, and it's worth a little bit of a drive. And like Kurt said, start a fellowship. Maybe your church isn't all that. So start a fellowship to supplement the encouragement and discipleship that you need. Find people to speak into your life. Watch excellent Kurt Mahlburg interviews together, and get fed on the gospel and the things that will point you in the right direction to help redeem the culture.
If I could just say one more thing, Dave. Sure. I'm jumping in. One more thing I'd love to just say to the pastors. It relates a bit to earlier we talked about politicians who are wary to weigh into these things and wear their faith on their sleeve. What I wanted to say back then is, if only they realized how many Australians would actually be delighted to hear them talk about their faith in God, because a lot of Australians do have a residual faith in God, belief in God. So politicians should come out, a lot more boldly and say, I'm a Christian and these are my values and I'm not apologetic for them. And in the same way, I would say to pastors, when it comes to these pointy cultural issues, I would say there's a lot more hunger in your congregation probably than you think to be clear on some of these really important issues, the transgender stuff, the gay conversion therapy, pro-life stuff, freedom of speech, Charlie Kirk's assassination. It's not a total litmus test of a church whether your pastor mentioned that or not, but I think there's a lot of pastors that probably wanted to and just were fearful about it. And yes, you're going to get some blowback. Of course, you're going to get some blowback when you lean into these issues, but it's worth it, because what you're doing is you're speaking to the younger generation who are hungry to know God and want to have answers to these things. And you're also speaking to a huge portion of your people who don't know what to make of it all, and they actually need your shepherding and your leadership on this stuff. So my encouragement is lean into these topics. Don't make your church, a political platform. It's not like the gospel should always be front and center. Jesus should always be the main character. But at the same time, we shouldn't be afraid to lean into these issues as they arise. And I think God is going to bless you for that, and you're going to see amazing fruit. So that's my encouragement to church leaders who are listening.
Yeah, good. If I can put that in a pithy little saying, the two things that we need to save Australia are politicians who are unafraid to articulate what God says about the debated issues, and pastors who are unafraid to articulate what God says about the debated issues. Politicians need to be comfortable to talk about God. They need to be bold and courageous. Pastors need to be comfortable to talk about politics and what God says about those debated issues. Where God has black and white authority on a debated issue, how dare anyone shrink back from saying what God says about that issue, let alone say anything contrary. So yeah, bolder pastors
absolutely.
and bolder politicians will be there is a nexus where these two overlap, and both politics and God has an opinion on how we should live with each other in communion. Obviously in community, not communion. So do you want to reflect on that? I think I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, those two sentences were brilliant, but I can summarize it even shorter into 3 words: church and state, right?
Come on.
It's a dirty combination in our culture, but it shouldn't be. For too long, we've been told that there should be this, really sharp divide between the two, and there the two shall meet. But God instituted both the church and the state. And when we talk about the separation of church and state, what that historically always meant in the Western world is that the state does not overreach into the affairs of the church and does not limit, religious freedom and the operation of the church, because God wants churches to be big and flourishing and thriving and influencing the culture. So that was never what the separation of church and state was about. But unfortunately, that's the mythology that has been passed down to us. And so we need a real reset on that. The phrase Christian nationalism, that's another whole, thing we could discuss. That accusation's been thrown around because of Charlie Kirk's memorial service. But all those guys were doing is that they have been elected in office, as you say, some of the most powerful people in the world, not just in the US, but in the world, part of Trump's cabinet. And each of them as individual elected representatives were speaking openly about their faith. That is not incurring on the separation of church and state. That's the state doing what it should, people electing leaders they want to lead their country, and individuals who are therefore elected sharing their faith openly from those positions of power. That's a beautiful thing. That's not some sort of scary Christian nationalism. We're going to take over the country and crush all religious opposition. That's absolutely nothing to do with it. And enough of those silly accusations. So
there's a really good response I want everybody to memorize and learn this. When somebody challenges you on the separation of church and state or Christian nationalism, I want you to ask them this question to reveal their heart and the truth with just the question. It's a really good, revealing question, just like Jesus asked. I was asked it earlier today, and you're just not sure of the person's agenda when they ask. Are they asking a loaded question to try and trap you, or are they genuinely trying to understand the issue? And that question might be, do you believe in the separation of church and state? My response is this: do you believe Christians should be allowed to vote? If you believe Christians should be allowed to vote, then you do not believe in the separation of church and state to the extent that Christians must keep their faith to themselves. They actually get to bring their whole person to a pluralistic, liberal, inclusive democracy. And if someone says, no, Christians shouldn't be allowed to vote, or adds conditions to it, then they're revealing themselves to be undemocratic, anti-democratic, and tyrannical.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another phrase I love: all of Christ for all of life. I think there's sort of a church movement in the US that has picked up on that phrase, and I think it's a fantastic one. Another quote from is it Alexander Kuyper, Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch Prime Minister from eons ago. He talked about how there's not one sphere of life over which Christ does not declare that is mine. And the idea that we as Christians can, we can give God our Sundays, and we can give him our Bible readings, and we can give him our small group, and we can give him our family even, and maybe some of our jobs and stuff like that, but not give him politics and not give him culture. That's ridiculous. We can't seal those parts of our life off from God and say, oh no, you're not allowed in this part. If we're going to, there's the quote, it's a great one. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine. He deserves all of it. If he is the Lord of glory, which he is, then he deserves every part of our life. And that includes our vote, that includes our political opinions, that includes our conversations about these topics, our convictions. And if you're a pastor, your sermons, your shepherding of your people on these issues, that's all. He has ownership over all of that stuff. So enough of this rubbish that, separation of church and state means we never, as Christians, never get into politics. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I use this quote, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine. I'm just trying to find a nice big graphic of it. I use that quote when people misquote to me or misapply things like Jesus saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, or my kingdom is not of this world. They're the two scriptures that people frequently use to try and argue against Christian activism. And the reality is that the reality is that what you're essentially arguing is that Christ is not sovereign over all, that Christ has no interest in politics, that Christ doesn't demand submission, obedience, cooperation, and lordship in the government policy, justice, and welfare of the nation and neighbours. I mean, it's such a preposterous quote, a preposterous application of those scriptures to suggest Jesus didn't pray for his kingdom to come and for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. The inconsistency with the harmony of Scripture is mind-boggling. So yeah. Appreciate your time, Kurt. Is there anything else you want to add to the show before I wrap it up and say goodbye to everyone?
No, it's been awesome chatting to you, Dave. I love, wrestling through these topics. I love chewing the fats. It's fantastic that people have been able to listen as well. Hopefully some of the stuff we've shared has been useful. I've certainly been edified by it and really enjoyed it. So thanks for having me on.
Won't be the last time for you, my friend. I think you and I need to chat very often. I've got a lot of respect for the work you do in redeeming the culture in Australia and equipping believers to be likewise engaged. So thank you for your service to the King.
Thank you so much.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. And don't forget to head to churchandstate.com.au if you are anywhere near or can get to Adelaide. We're going to be there on the 11th of October for the Church and State Adelaide Conference. We are Seeking God for South Australia. They've got an election coming up in 6 months. If you're in South Australia, you've got an election coming up on the 21st of March in 2026. My wonderful friend here, Kurt Mahlburg, will be one of the speakers. We'll be talking about church reformation. I'll be talking about the separation of church and state. And we're going to be examining the political issues that are on the agenda that the parties and the lying harlot media may not tell you about. But we want to ask God, what's breaking your heart? How can we represent you with our votes, with our activism, with our volunteering, with our donations to promote the kingdom of God, righteousness for our neighbors? And as you say in Isaiah, God, that you command us to give the oppressed reason to celebrate. That's what we want to do with our political activism. It's not about creating a mandatory Christian nation or accumulating power for Christians. It's about loving our neighbor and seeking first the kingdom of God. If you want to learn how to vote like a Christian, get yourself to the Church and State Adelaide Conference. Tickets are available now on the website christiansvote.com.au, christiansvote.com.au. And wherever you are in the state or the nation, you'll be able to watch those excellent teaching videos after the conference, as well as a whole lot of other election resources. Thank you to the partners and sponsors who give financially to make this possible. If you would like to become one, head to churchandstate.com.au and click on the donate button. But that's it for this episode of the Church and State Show and the series, How to Save Australia. God bless you and God bless Australia.